Individualism is the idea that an individual should be able to choose to do what he wants with his life. He should not be subservient to a collective. He should be able to choose whether or not he wants to go to war, if he wants to buy bread, if he wants to buy apples, what kind of apples. He chooses. He does not have to ask a collective or a group of individuals to make his own personal decisions. Collectivism, on the other side, is not completely the opposite, but nearly the opposite, where the collective can make decisions for you, and so the collective can choose and say, you should go to war for us. Like the draft, for example, would be a collective idea. We force people to go to war in order to preserve our countries. Ants, for example, are very collectivist animals. Ants, bees, termites, which I will at some point come back to. There doesn't seem to be any true, uniquely identifiable characteristic between individualism and collectivism, since one depends on the other. Individualism depends on some type of collectivism. If you are completely alone, first of all, you can't eat anything, assuming you're completely alone. Completely alone. There is nothing to eat. There's just the ground around you. Then you would have, for you to be a successful organism, you either need to live forever or create an offspring. It's far more likely that you'd create an offspring than live forever, since at some point you'd get crushed by a rock or something would happen. And so that would be the end of you, and for all intents and purposes, in that particular example, of all life itself. And so you need to create a second individual, and right then and there, that's it. Collectivism. You're stuck with it. You have no choice. And then from there, you depend as much on that organism as you do on yourself for survival and procreation. It seems that individualism is just a fancy way of saying that we're going to put a little more value on the individual than we would otherwise. We're going to... This ends up by being weird because I haven't done a video on economics, but it's the same thing as the difference between capitalism and socialism. People think that we have a capitalist system. No, we have a socialist system with very few rules. So a capitalistic system is just it's just free-range economics. So all of nature works through a capitalistic point of view. Capitalism used to be, like true capitalism used to exist a couple hundred years ago. True capitalism, there's simply no laws to economics. You let your kids work. It doesn't matter. They'll make a carpet, and then that's money. There are no limits to what you will do for economic gain. That is pure capitalism. The instant you put any limit whatsoever, you end up with a socialistic system. Now, this socialistic system allows you to run at a loss so that in the future you could potentially run at a significantly greater economic output. It's the same thing as why we put so much resources into a newborn, because in the end they will be worth whatever resources we put into them. They should create more resources than we put into them. It's worth our time. And so, at least human beings specifically, we are born collectivists. You will never be a true individual as a human being. We are built to socialize. We are built to be around each other. We depend on every single, not every single person, but more than just yourself. If it was just yourself in the world, it would be significantly harder for you to build shelter, hunt, or raise your kids. You can even have kids if you're alone, but even if you expand your group to 2 people, just to be able to have one specific offspring, your life is much harder, and it's much harder to get luxuries or things that simplify your life. This is it just brings us to civilization. That's exactly what makes civilization so great. The greater the technology, the easier it is to get resources, which lets you do other things other than get resources and simply survive. But as we see again, you need a collective for the individual to matter. You need that collective. The individual hides behind it's not hides, but exists behind the collective. And so you do have your individuality, but behind the collective. You always have a collective before you have the individual. And so you have a limited form of individualism. And so, yes, then at that point you could say, well, then that's what I mean by individualism. To which I would say, yes, but you could always change that exact amount of individualism. It so happens to be that today it's advantageous for you to have this amount of individualism, and then tomorrow it'll be disadvantageous. And so it changes day by day. It changes all the time. It changes situation by situation. And so it becomes meaningless. It's no longer uniquely identifiable. It's just different measurements of how collective you are. That's it. It is not a statement of individualism. It is a statement of collectivism. And then how much of a collective are you? And then how advantageous is it to be this collective today versus this collective tomorrow? And that's it. It's never a statement about purely individualistic living conditions. From here, I'll go full anti-SJW, if you will, and I'll bring the concept of gender. It seems to be that people argue, oh, there's two genders. Yes, currently, right now, this very moment, if you look around, you'll say, oh, there's a man and there's a woman. That seems to be the two large categories. And it seems to be that if you go look in the animal world, it's the same thing. If you find a gender, you will find two major genders, and then that doesn't mean there isn't any other ones. It's just that they're not major, so they're more considered as the outcasts. Okay, but you have to think about it from a purely evolutionary perspective. Think about it from a purely evolutionary perspective. From a purely evolutionary perspective, there are infinite genders. There is no end. So I'll go through the full explanation. If you start from the beginning, there are no genders. The original organisms did not have gender. So gender needs to evolve. There's only a couple of ways it can evolve. I'm not necessarily going to enumerate them, but let's assume that now we have gender. We are at a point that we have gender. Well, actually, I'll have to go through some enumerations. So as the organisms are born, some of them are born psychologically different, slightly psychologically different. And then, but they're different just enough that they are advantageous in different situations. Like one could be slightly larger and he's stronger to just stay put, never move. Okay? Or one just sticks to the ground. He just stays there. The other one just flies off and goes, gathers resources to build a nest or whatever. It doesn't really matter what he does. The point is that one of them has a characteristic that is advantageous in a very particular situation, and the other one has a characteristic that is very advantageous in another particular situation. And then at some point they become codependent. As these organisms since they're mutually beneficial to each other, they start creating technically two species, but not actually two species, because they still always codependent. And then at some point you could end up with some kind of idea of gender. And so they could end up by sharing their genetic code to create the better offspring. So it's just sexual reproduction. But the point is that those animals did not have the same characteristics as human beings. Well then, clearly those genders are not the same genders as human beings. And so right then and there, if you have two genders, male and female, for human beings, clearly you have to invent two new categories for whatever those animals are. So right then and there, you've got more than two. That's the end of that. There are more than two genders. So then the question becomes, then why isn't there more than two genders at any given time? And that is the true question. That is the question you should be asking. That is the question that matters the most. At any given time, for one specific species, you will always only have, well, see, I can't guarantee that, but it seems that after all of these billions of years of evolution, it seems that if gender evolves, it evolves in pairs. There are only two major genders. And the reason for that, at least if you ask me, would be sexual success. If you want to be sexually successful, you need at least one other individual. So you need to find that individual. That individual needs to share their genetic code, however that happens. There needs to be enough resources between all three of you for you to give birth to at least two offsprings for this to be worth it. So that means you need, at least momentarily, enough resources for 3 organisms to be fed. So for 3 organisms, the reason I didn't say 4, that would be both parents would be born, and then the two children would be born. But if you assume that one of the parents dies as the third one is born, at any given time, you're only going to have three organisms. So you could save resources, and then the offsprings and the remaining survivors could eat the now dead parent, which would give you a stable population. This would not give you an increasing growth population. So if you want growth, then at minimum you're going to have 4 individuals, or the likely case is 5 individuals, but you could do it with 4 if one of the parents were to sacrifice themselves. If you were to increase sexual reproduction to 3 individuals, which I'm sure has happened at some point during some organism's evolutionary path, it must have happened. But clearly that organism is dead. He is gone. He has not survived whatever he has encountered. It has died. For you to have 3 genders, for all intents and purposes, for 3 individuals to be required in one sexual relationship for you to have 1 offspring, it significantly increases the difficulty in finding a third organism. You have to find a third organism. And that third organism needs to be alive. It's the same thing as the other 2. So you need an extra bit of resources for another organism. And then what does he benefit? What does the third organism actually benefit to the relationship? And it seems to me that if you can afford a third organism, there is a very good chance you can afford a 4th. And so to me, it seems that once you go past 2 organisms, if a species were to make the jump to a 3rd gender or a 4th gender, instead of going up a gender, it would actually gain collectivist ideologies. It would become a social organism, like we have become, like mammals have become. And then from that point on, having social animals, it's much, 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 much more advantageous, because you only share resources when you have too much. And so as these 2 couples at that point, that's what they would become. They would be couples. So if one couple lives, a bit away, and you live over here, if they have a tiny bit too many resources, if you're social, then they can give you some of those resources. So one couple could be slightly more successful at any given time, and then they could help each other out. But if you have 3 organisms in one sexual relationship, all 3 depend on each other. It's harder for you to have social behaviors because you need more organisms before it becomes a social grouping, and it requires more resources for one offspring. It also lowers the amount of offsprings being born, because now you need 3 organisms per offspring instead of 2 organisms. And you could end up with some odd pairings, like a fish. So you have 2 official parents, and there's a 3rd fish that goes around and gives its genetic code to every other offspring. But then you end up with some weird ant-like colony where you have the king animal, and then that king animal rules over all the other animals. We call him the alpha. It doesn't really matter in this particular case. It's a weird way of putting it. But you could imagine it happening. But instantly you see that it becomes a much more complex structure, and there's a whole colony. It's a very collectivist. If you make the jump and you look at ants now, to see what it looks like when you have a fully interdependent system of organisms. Ants and termites bees are very interdependent. They have gone full collectivists. They depend on each other. It's not just one organism giving life to offsprings. It's the entire colony. It's hundreds and thousands and hundreds of thousands. It's so many organisms giving the chance to those particular organisms to live. But you see, ants have one large advantage, and that's the fact that they reproduce very fast. Humans don't have that. You actually have to spend a lot of resources on your organism. And I guess this is somewhat of a good segue, because JF wants to come out with a book, and he seems to want to give us a new idea as to how humans are going to evolve with the advances in biology, CRISPR, and genetic modification. And since we have computers, and JF's idea is that computers are going to start playing with our code, and the computers are going to decide what code lives and what dies, and And at some point, it's just competing computers. So the computers compete against each other, creating the most offsprings that are the most advantageous. And then, if you want the dystopian future, they could start attacking each other. Oh my God, it's the computer wars. It seems to me like JF wants to make the claim that the humans, because of the computers, we will become fully collectivist. Or at least his fear or his dystopian future would be that we become fully collectivist. And we become that. We become an ant colony, entirely dependent on the computers that build our genetic code. I do not disagree with what he's stating. My only problem is that he seems to make the claim that once we program those computers know what is advantageous characteristics. The problem with evolution, with planning evolution for the future, it's always easy to look in the past and say, well, clearly, if you had fins, you could live in the water. Clearly, if you just grew gills. It's very easy when you look at the past to make predictions. But when you're looking towards the future, you do not know, as an individual, what will happen in the future. And so you have to make the claim that the computer you're building actually knows what's going to happen in the future. Which it doesn't. But then you're dependent on the algorithm that you built that's going to know what's going to happen in the future. And I don't care what you say, and you say, oh, it's true AI, and I swear to God it'll just figure out everything all the time. You don't know that. You do not know that. There is no proof that you can make that can state for a fact that you will be able to account for all variables all the time. You can't make that statement. And so the computers might end up in dead ends much faster than we think. I think our biggest worry would be if computers take full control and they end up in a dead end. We're stuck like that, my friend. Human beings become mindless robots stuck in a dead end. They'll be like ants in a death spiral. For those of you who don't know, yes, ants do this. They are so collectivist that sometimes they end up in a circle and they keep spinning until they die. They just spin until exhaustion and then they die. And so if that's the future that the JF predicts for us, that is a very sad future. Now, I do not think this will happen. It seems that it would be pretty easy to put some laws around this and say maybe we should make a test population first and send them all on Mars or Titan or something. Seems like it's pretty easy to avoid. Seems like I don't think we're gonna end up like that. But then to add to the perhaps I should put it in another video. I think I'll do another video for purely genetic modification and human advancement. Where should we go? How should we go? What should be the laws that we should put into place so this makes any sense, so that we don't end up in a death spiral, in an ant colony death spiral. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for listening. Hopefully Rucka sees this and hopefully makes him think a little. Hopefully on his next live stream I can be there again and fight him a little more. Convert him. Anyway. If you can, donate to my Patreon, and goodbye.